Nobody wants to hear your made-up war stories. As people in the diner start to stare and whisper, not knowing that this quiet grandfather once saved 22 men from a burning helicopter, crashed deep in enemy territory during the worst days of Vietnam. If you think you know how this story ends, think again. What happens next will leave you speechless and remind you why we should never judge a book by its cover. Happens when that uniform walks through the door. Harold had been coming to Mel's diner every Saturday morning for the past 3 years. He always sat in the same corner booth, ordered black coffee and scrambled eggs, and sometimes shared stories with whoever would listen. Today was different, though. Today, a group of bikers had rolled into town for some motorcycle rally. His name was Tank, and he made sure everyone knew he was the leader of his group. He wore his leather jacket like armor and spoke like he owned. Every place he walked into, Tank looked down at the small photo album Harold had been showing to the young waitress, Sarah. The pages were filled with old black and white pictures of soldiers in jungle uniforms. Tank grabbed the album and flipped through it with dirty fingers. "Look at this garbage. This old fool thinks he's some kind of war hero. Probably bought these pictures at a flea market." The other bikers started laughing and pointing at Harold. Harold tried to reach for his album, but Tank pulled it away. "Please," Harold said in a quiet voice. "Those pictures mean a lot to me." "Oh, boo-hoo, old man. You're fake friends from your fake war. Why don't you go home and play soldier in your backyard?" The whole diner had gone quiet now. Families with children stopped eating and stared. The teenage workers behind the counter didn't know what to do. Sarah, the young waitress who had been talking with Harold, stepped forward to help, but Tank waved her away. "You know what really bugs me about people like you? You sit here making up stories about being tough guys when real men like us are out here actually living." Harold's hands started shaking, but not from fear. Before, in different places, in darker times. But he was old now, and tired, and alone. His wife Margaret had died 2 years ago. His son lived across the country. Maybe you should call your mommy to come pick you up. The other bikers found this hilarious. A few families got up and left. Not wanting their children to see what was happening, Harold tried one more time to get his album back. "Those pictures are of my unit," he said. "We served together in Vietnam. They deserve respect." Tank threw the album on the floor. "Your unit," he said, stepping on the scattered photos. "The only unit you were in was the Senior Center's Checkers Club. Stop lying to everyone and stop wasting space in this diner." The photos scattered across the dirty floor, pictures of young soldiers smiling at the camera, shots of military camps, images of Harold receiving medals from officers in crisp uniforms. One photo slid under a nearby table. It showed Harold decades younger. His back hurt, but he carefully gathered each photo like it was made of gold. Other people in the diner watched, but nobody helped. They were too scared of Tank and his friends. Tank stood over Harold and kept talking. "You know what I think, old man? I think you're one of those fake soldiers who never left his hometown but tells everyone war stories he saw in movies." Tank saw this and snatched it away from him. "What's this supposed to be?" Tank asked, waving the photo around. Of Hero. As Tank mocked him. Harold's mind went back to that terrible day in 1971. He could still smell the burning fuel, still hear the screams of the wounded soldiers trapped inside the helicopter. 22 times he went in, his head. But Harold said none of this out loud. He just kept picking up his pictures in silence, while sitting around making up stories about being heroes when you probably never even left your home state, making real veterans look bad with your fake tales. Tank's friends were eating this up. Said he probably claimed he single-handedly won the whole war. The teenage boy working the cash, anger toward the boy. "Shut up, kid. Adults are talking. Unless you want to join your fake war hero friend on the floor." The boy backed away quickly. He bent down and got right in Harold's face. "I'm going to tell you something, old man. My grandfather was a real veteran. He fought in World War II and never said a word about it his whole life. That's how real soldiers act. They don't sit in diners telling fairy tales to waitresses." Harold finally looked up at Tank. "Your grandfather sounds like a good man," he said softly. "Many of us came home and never talked about what we saw. But that doesn't mean we weren't there." Tank laughed harshly. "That's rich. My grandfather was a hero. More uncomfortable, but nobody knew what to do." Tank was big and mean. and his biker friends looked just as tough. The diner staff were all young kids who didn't want any trouble. Harold finished collecting his photos and tried to stand up. This, as another chance to mock him. "Look at him struggle," Tank said to his friends. "Can't even get up without help. This is supposed to be our big, tough war hero." To just walk away from the whole situation, but Tank stepped in front of him, blocking his path to the door. "Where do you think you're going, old-timer?" Tank asked. "I'm not done talking to you yet. I want you to admit to everyone here that you've been lying about being a soldier. I want you to tell all these people that you made up those war stories." Harold looked around the diner. All eyes were on him. Families with children, teenage workers, other elderly customers. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. Tank, but they were too scared to do it themselves. "I'm not lying," Harold said quietly. "Those photos are real, and so are the men in them." Tank shook his head and smiled like he had just caught Harold in a trap. "Say you were a Green Beret while you're at it. Or maybe a fighter pilot. The guy who personally ended the war." Harold's face turned red, but not from embarrassment. For the first time since this whole thing started, he was getting angry. These men were making fun of his service, his friends, his memories of brothers who never made it home. He had stayed, quiet and humble, for 3 years in this diner, never bragging or showing off. But this was going too far. "I never claimed to be anything special," Harold said, his voice getting a little stronger. "I was just a crew chief who did his job. But I won't let you disrespect the men who died serving their country." Tank saw that. Harold was getting upset and pushed harder. "Oh, now he's getting tough," Tank announced to the room. "The fake war hero is finally showing his true colors. What are you going to do, old man? Challenge me to a fight? Show everyone your super-secret martial arts moves?" The mockery continued for several more minutes. Tank seemed to be enjoying himself, putting on a show for his friends and the captive audience in the diner. He kept pushing Harold to admit he was lying, kept making jokes about his age and his service record, kept treating him like a foolish old man who didn't deserve any respect. But then the bell above the diner door chimed, and someone new walked. In Dot, the man who entered was tall and straight-backed, wearing the dress blue uniform of the United States Army. His uniform was perfect, every ribbon in place, every crease sharp, every button polished. The silver eagles on his shoulders marked him as a full colonel, and the rows of ribbons on his chest told the story of a long and distinguished career. Colonel Marcus Webb had been driving through town on his way to a military ceremony when he decided to stop for coffee. He had no idea what he was walking into, but as soon as he stepped through the door, he could feel the tension in the room. Tank and his friends stopped talking when they saw the uniform. The whole diner went completely silent. Everyone stared at the colonel as he looked around the room, then took in the scattered photos on the floor, Tank's aggressive posture, and the frightened faces of the other customers. He had been in the Army for 28 years, and he could read a situation like this in seconds. "Is there a problem here?" Colonel Webb asked, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Tank straightened up a little when he saw the colonel, but he wasn't ready to back down. "No problem, sir," Tank said, trying to sound respectful. "Just having a conversation with this gentleman about his military service." Colonel Webb looked at Harold more carefully. He saw the old man's shaking hands, his red face, his carefully guarded dignity. He saw the photo album clutched tightly to Harold's chest. Most importantly, he saw something in Harold's eyes that he recognized, the look of a man who had seen combat and carried its weight for decades. "What branch did you serve in, sir?" Colonel Webb asked Harold directly. Harold looked surprised that someone was actually asking him a respectful question. "1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam," he answered quietly. "Helicopter crew chief, 1970 to 1972. Colonel Webb nodded slowly. He knew the 1st Cav's reputation. They had been involved in some of the heaviest fighting of the Vietnam War, including major battles that were still studied at military schools. A helicopter crew chief in that unit would have seen more combat than most soldiers in any war. Tank couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Don't believe him, Colonel," Tank said. "This old guy has been making up war stories all morning. Probably never even left his hometown. But he's got a whole album of fake photos trying to convince people he's some kind of hero. Colonel." The colonel didn't say anything at first, just looked at Tank like he was examining something unpleasant he had found on his shoe. "And who are you to question this man's service?" Colonel Webb asked quietly. Tank shifted uncomfortably but tried to maintain his tough attitude. I'm just someone who respects real veterans, he said. My grandfather fought in World War II, and he never bragged about it like this guy does, Colonel. Webb's expression didn't change. Your grandfather sounds like an honorable man, he said, especially when you clearly know nothing about what you're talking about. The colonel walked over to where some of Harold's photos were still scattered on the floor. He bent down and picked up the picture of the helicopter crash, the one Tank had been mocking. When he saw it, his whole demeanor changed. Colonel Webb studied the photo for a long moment, then looked up at Harold with new respect. Sir, was this taken at Landing Zone Charlie, November 1971? Harold's eyes widened in surprise. Yes, sir, it was. How did you know? I was a young lieutenant with the 229th Aviation Battalion. We provided support for your unit during Operation Match. Before, but now, it was dead silent. Everyone stared at the colonel as he continued speaking. I remember this day like it was yesterday, Colonel Webb said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. A Chinook helicopter carrying wounded soldiers was shot down by enemy fire. The pilot was killed on impact, and the aircraft caught fire with men trapped inside. While enemy bullets were flying all around us, one helicopter crew chief made 22 trips into that burning aircraft to pull out every single wounded soldier. He looked directly at Harold. That crew chief's name was Staff Sergeant Harold Micho. He saved every man on that helicopter, including me. His friends had stopped laughing and were looking at the floor, with completely different expressions now. Colonel Webb wasn't finished. Staff Sergeant Mitchell was awarded the Silver Star for his actions that day, he continued, but that wasn't the only time he showed extraordinary courage. Over his 2 tours in Vietnam, he participated in over 40 combat missions, saved dozens of lives, and exemplified everything we hope for in an American soldier. The colonel handed the photo back to Harold with obvious respect. Sir, it is an honor to meet you again after all these years. I never got the chance to properly thank you for saving my life. Harold's eyes filled with tears as he shook the colonel's hand. You don't need to thank me, sir, he said quietly. I was just doing my job. Any of us would have done the same thing. That's where you're wrong, Colonel Webb replied. Not everyone would have run into a burning helicopter 22 times while under enemy fire. What you did that day was heroic, whether you want to call it that or not. Tank had been getting smaller and smaller as the conversation went on. Now he looked like he wanted to disappear completely. His tough attitude was gone, replaced by shame and embarrassment. Colonel Webb turned to address Tank directly. You said your grandfather was a World War II veteran who never talked about his service. That's common among men of his generation. They came home and got on with their lives without seeking recognition or glory. Staff Sergeant Mitchell here is cut from the same cloth. He's not in this diner bragging about his service. He's quietly living his life, occasionally sharing memories with people who show interest in his stories. The colonel's voice got harder. What you did here today was shameful. You insulted a genuine American hero based on nothing but your own ignorance and prejudice. You owe this man an apology, and you owe everyone in this diner an apology for subjecting them to your disgraceful behavior. Tank looked around the room at all the faces staring at him. He saw disappointment, anger, and disgust in their eyes. His own friends were backing away from him, clearly embarrassed to be associated with what had happened. I'm sorry, Tank said quietly, looking at Harold. I was wrong. I shouldn't have said those things. Harold nodded and accepted the apology gracefully, but Colonel Webb wasn't satisfied. That's not enough, the colonel said. You spent the last 15 minutes publicly humiliating this man in front of all these people. You called him a liar, threw his precious photos on the floor, and made a mockery of his service. A quiet apology doesn't undo that damage. Tank looked, confused and scared. What do you want me to do? He asked. Colonel Webb thought for a moment. I want you to tell everyone in this diner exactly who Staff Sergeant Harold Mitchell is and what he did in Vietnam. I want you to give him the public recognition you tried to take away from him. Tank swallowed hard and looked around the room. Everyone was still watching and waiting. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice shaky and uncertain. This is Staff Sergeant Harold Mitchell, Tank said loudly enough for everyone to hear. He served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division as a helicopter crew chief. He saved 22 soldiers from a burning helicopter crash while under enemy fire. He was awarded the Silver Star for bravery and served his country with honor. The applause started slowly, just one person clapping, then another, then more. Soon the entire diner was applauding Harold, who stood there with tears in his eyes. Overwhelmed by the sudden recognition and respect, Colonel Webb shook Harold's hand again and invited him to be his guest at the military ceremony he was attending. Harold accepted gratefully, and as they prepared to leave together, the young waitress Sarah approached them. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said, "I'm so sorry about what happened. I wish I had stood up for you earlier." Harold smiled at her kindly. "You don't need to apologize, dear. You were always respectful to me, and that means more than you know." As Harold and Colonel Webb walked toward the door, the other customers in the diner began approaching Harold to shake his hand and thank him for his service. Tank and his friends had already left, sneaking out the back door in shame. Outside in the parking lot, Colonel Webb asked Harold if he would be interested in speaking at military events and schools about his experiences. Harold said he would think about it, but admitted he had never considered himself anyone special. "That's exactly what makes you special, Sergeant Mitchell," Colonel Webb replied. "True heroes never think they're heroes. They just do what needs to be done." As they parted ways, Harold realized that for the first time in years, he felt proud of his service again. The encounter with Tank had been painful and humiliating, but it had also led to something he never expected: recognition from a fellow veteran, and renewed respect for what he had accomplished so long ago. Harold returned to Mel's Diner the following Saturday, as was his habit, but this time things were different. Sarah greeted him warmly, and several other customers came over to sit with him and listen to his stories. The manager had even put up a small plaque near Harold's usual booth that read "Reserved for Our American Hero." Harold Mitchell had spent decades carrying his memories quietly, never seeking attention or praise for what he had done in Vietnam. One biker's cruelty had nearly broken his spirit, but it had also brought him face to face with the recognition he had always deserved. Sometimes the worst moments in life lead to the best ones, and sometimes heroes are found in the most unexpected places.